A freezing bear with two cubs appeared at his cabin. What the man did next will leave you speechless. What would you do if the wilderness brought desperate visitors to your doorstep in the dead of winter? As a brutal storm raged outside, a freezing mother bear and her two cubs sought refuge at a solitary cabin. Faced with a life-or-death decision, one man defied all expectations in a way that would leave you speechless. This extraordinary tale of courage and compassion will make you rethink the boundaries between humans and nature. The Alaskan wilderness was no place for hesitation, especially not in the dead of winter. Mike Anderson knew this better than most. His life was ruled by the careful routines he had perfected over years of living alone in a cabin, deep in the forest. Every action was deliberate, from the way he chopped wood into perfectly stackable logs to the precise measurements he used when rationing his supplies. At 45 degrees below zero, even the smallest mistake could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Tonight, however, even those routines felt fragile as an unprecedented storm gathered outside, its icy winds howling through the towering spruce trees like an angry spirit. Mike sat by the wood stove, the dim orange glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. His hands were wrapped around a steaming mug of tea as he listened to the storm's ferocity. Snow battered the windows, and the cabin groaned under the relentless gusts. He glanced at the thermometer hanging near the door. The needle hovered just below -45 degrees, the coldest it had been all winter. Mike exhaled slowly, watching his breath turn to mist. Even within the relative warmth of the cabin, a quiet unease settled in his chest. Storms like this were dangerous, even for a man as prepared as he was. But routine kept him grounded. Earlier that day, he had double-checked his woodpile, ensuring he had enough to last through the night. His pantry was stocked with canned goods and dried meats, though he knew he'd need to start hunting again soon. Everything was in its place. He was safe. That knowledge should have been enough to keep him calm. Then he heard it, a faint, desperate cry rising above the storm's fury. Mike froze, his ears straining to identify the sound. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, its shifting tones mimicking something almost human. But there it was again, a low, guttural moan followed by shorter, high-pitched yelps. Setting his mug down, he stood, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. His pulse quickened as he moved toward the window, peering out into the swirling snow. Visibility was nearly non-existent, the storm turning the world outside into a chaotic blur of white and gray. Still, the sound came again. Louder now, undeniably real. "Damn," Mike muttered under his breath. Grabbing his heavy parka from the hook near the door, he pulled it on with practiced efficiency. He hesitated as his hand reached for his boots, his mind racing through the possibilities. Wild animals weren't uncommon in this part of Alaska. Wolves, moose, even the occasional bear. But they rarely ventured close to the cabin. Most creatures avoided humans, and in weather like this, they would be hunkered down in whatever shelter they could find. Whatever was out there had to be desperate, and desperation often spelled danger. Mike pulled on his boots and gloves, then reached for the shotgun propped against the wall. Slinging it over his shoulder, he cracked open the cabin door. The icy wind tore through the small opening, stinging his face and forcing him to squint against the snow. The cries were clearer now, and they cut through him in a way he couldn't ignore. "What in the hell is out there?" he muttered, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door shut behind him. The cold was immediate and unforgiving, seeping through the layers of his clothing as he trudged into the storm. His flashlight beam barely pierced the blizzard, the snow swirling in frantic patterns that disoriented him with every step. The sound guided him, closer now, a mix of heavy, labored breathing and the occasional whimper. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his cabin and let nature take its course. But his gut wouldn't let him. Something about those cries was too raw, too pleading. After what felt like an eternity, Mike's flashlight caught a glimpse of movement ahead. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest as he focused the beam. There, barely visible against the snow, was the massive form of a bear. The mother was huddled low, her body curled protectively around two cubs, their smaller forms pressed tightly against her side. The sight froze Mike in place, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen bears before, of course, but never like this. The mother was thin, her fur matted with ice, and her breaths came in short, wheezing bursts. The cubs fared no better, their tiny bodies trembling violently as they clung to her warmth. The storm had driven them far from their den, and it was clear they wouldn't survive the night without shelter. Mike tightened his grip on the flashlight, his mind racing. Every survival instinct he had learned over the years screamed at him to back away. A bear, even one in this condition, was dangerous. But the sight of those cubs, so small, so fragile, rooted him to the spot. "Damn it," he whispered again, lowering the flashlight. He took a tentative step closer, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The mother bear raised her head weakly, her eyes locking onto his. There was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion and desperation. Mike knew he was taking an enormous risk, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice low and steady. He slowly shrugged off his pack, reaching inside for the small bundle of dried fish he always carried on outings. He tossed one of the pieces toward her, the fish landing in the snow a few feet away. The bear sniffed weakly, her nose twitching before she lowered her head again, too drained to move. Mike took another step forward, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're gonna get me killed," he muttered, shaking his head as he backed away. The bears watched him go, their forms disappearing into the storm as he retraced his steps to the cabin. Once inside, he moved quickly, clearing out the small storage room near the back of the cabin. He worked with a frantic energy, piling supplies into the main room and spreading a thick layer of old blankets across the floor. When the room was ready, Mike grabbed a rope and tied the storage room door shut. If he was going to do this, he wasn't taking any more risks than necessary. With one final glance at the room, he pulled on his coat and headed back into the storm. The bears were exactly where he had left them, the cubs huddled tightly against their mother. "Come on," Mike said softly, tossing another piece of fish toward the trio. He waved his flashlight, stepping back toward the cabin and praying they would follow. To his amazement, the mother bear stirred. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her massive frame. She nudged the cubs forward, her movements hesitant but deliberate, and they began to follow Mike's light through the storm. Each step felt like a lifetime, the wind cutting through them as they made their way toward the cabin. When they finally reached the porch, Mike opened the storage room door and stepped aside. The bears entered cautiously, their instincts battling their desperation. The mother settled into the corner, curling protectively around her cubs as Mike secured the door behind them. He stood there for a long moment, his back pressed against the wall as he listened to their labored breaths. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside a fragile peace had taken hold. For the first time in years, Mike felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd lost. The storm raged through the night, the relentless wind battering the walls of the cabin as if testing its strength. Inside, Mike Anderson sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the closed door of the storage room. Behind that door lay the mother bear and her two cubs, their survival balanced on the razor's edge of chance and Mike's precarious decision to intervene. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his mug of black coffee, the heat barely registering through his calloused fingers. It had been hours since he had guided them into the room, yet the weight of their presence pressed heavily against his thoughts. Every survival instinct screamed at him that he had made a mistake. Wild animals didn't belong inside, not even in situations as dire as this. He had learned that lesson early, living out here in the Alaskan wilderness. Nature had rules and humans were not exempt from them. Bears, no matter how weak or desperate, were dangerous. A mother bear, especially, was capable of extraordinary violence when she felt her cubs were threatened. Yet as Mike stared at the door, hearing the faint, labored breath from the other side, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. He rose from the table and stepped carefully toward the door. A small, makeshift window in the wood allowed him to peer inside without opening it. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The mother bear was curled tightly around her cubs, her large body a barrier against the cold. Her fur, still matted with ice and snow, rose and fell with each shallow breath. The cubs, smaller than he'd realized in the storm, were nestled against her, their tiny bodies trembling but alive. One of them shifted slightly, pressing closer to its sibling, and Mike felt a pang in his chest. He backed away, letting out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He couldn't leave them like this. Grabbing a bucket, he filled it with lukewarm water and placed a few small fish from his pantry on a metal tray. His movements were deliberate, careful, as though the bears could sense his intentions through the walls. Mike placed the food and water near the door, then opened it just enough to slide the items through before quickly shutting it again. The mother bear's head lifted at the sound, her dark eyes narrowing with wary recognition. For a moment, she didn't move. Mike held his breath, watching through the small window as the bear sniffed the air cautiously. Finally, she stretched her neck toward the tray, nudging it with her nose before taking a tentative bite. The cubs, emboldened by her actions, shuffled forward, their tiny mouths seeking out the scraps of fish. Mike felt a small swell of relief. At least they were eating. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Mike's life. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, set his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bears would sense their confinement and lash out, tearing through the door in a panic. The rope he had used to secure it seemed laughably inadequate against the strength of a fully grown bear. Yet the hours stretched into dawn, and the door remained intact. When morning came, the storm showed no sign of relenting. The cabin windows were nearly opaque with frost, and snow had piled up against the door, creating a barrier that would take hours to clear. Mike stoked the wood stove, the crackling flames doing little to quiet the unease that had settled over him. He peered into the storage room again, noting that the bears had moved slightly. The mother bear seemed more alert, her eyes scanning the small space as though evaluating its safety. One of the cubs let out a small, pitiful whimper, and the sound pierced through Mike like a knife. Grabbing his coat, he ventured outside to gather more firewood, his boots crunching against the thick snow. The wind clawed at his exposed skin, and the cold bit through his layers as he trudged to the shed. His mind wandered as he worked, the repetitive motion of splitting logs offering a strange sense of calm. He thought about the bear's arrival, about the desperation in the mother's eyes as she had stumbled into the storm with her cubs in tow. What had driven her from her den? Had she been searching for food, or had the storm simply overwhelmed her? As he stacked the wood and returned to the cabin, another thought struck him. What if they didn't survive? The cubs were so small, so fragile. Even with the shelter and food, their chances seemed precarious at best. Mike shook his head, trying to banish the thought. He had already taken the risk. There was no turning back now. Inside, he checked on the bears again, sliding another tray of fish and a fresh bucket of water through the door. This time, the mother bear rose more quickly, her movements stronger than before. She sniffed the air, her sharp gaze landing briefly on Mike through the window before turning her attention to the food. Mike found himself holding his breath again, watching as she fed herself and her cubs with quiet determination. By the second day, the bears showed signs of improvement. The mother's breathing had steadied, and the cubs moved with more energy, their tiny bodies no longer trembling as violently. Mike couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe they had a chance after all. That night, as the storm began to ease, Mike sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He thought about the risks he had taken, the rules he had broken to help these animals. His mind drifted back to the day he first arrived in Alaska, searching for solitude and answers he couldn't find anywhere else. He had come here to escape, to distance himself from the noise and chaos of the world. But now he realized that even in isolation, he couldn't ignore the call of compassion. The bears had changed something in him, awakened a part of himself he thought he had buried long ago. They were a reminder that life, no matter how wild or untamed, was fragile and precious. As he sat there, the faint sound of the cubs' soft breaths coming from the storage room, Mike felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. By the time the storm finally began to break, the sun casting pale light over the snow-covered landscape, the bears were stronger. The mother bear paced near the door, her movements steady and deliberate. She no longer looked like the desperate creature Mike had found in the storm. There was strength in her now, a quiet resilience that mirrored the wilderness itself. Mike stood by the door, watching her through the window. "You're ready, aren't you?" he murmured. He knew the time was coming to let them go, But the thought left an ache in his chest. They had survived, but letting them return to the wild meant saying goodbye. That night, as the last remnants of the storm faded into silence, Mike prepared himself for what was to come. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. The bears had left a mark on his life that would never fade. The days following the storm brought an eerie stillness to the Alaskan wilderness. The world outside Mike Anderson's cabin had been transformed into a vast, white expanse, the snow glistening under the pale winter sun. Inside, the air was warmer, quieter, as if the cabin itself held its breath. The mother bear and her 2 cubs remained in the storage room, their presence a constant reminder of the storm's ferocity and the delicate balance of survival. Mike's routine had shifted to accommodate his unexpected guests, his life now revolving around their care and his cautious attempts to avoid startling them. Each morning began the same way. Mike would brew a strong cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin as he mentally prepared for the task ahead. The bears were growing stronger, which brought both relief and a new layer of tension. As he approached the storage room door, he moved with deliberate slowness, speaking softly to announce his presence. "Morning, Mama," he said one day, his voice low but steady. "I've got breakfast for you." He slid another tray of fish and a bucket of water through the small gap he had cleared near the door. The mother bear, who had grown accustomed to his routine, waited silently in the corner, her sharp eyes watching every movement. The cubs were more curious now, their tiny noses twitching as they approached the food with cautious steps. Mike couldn't help but smile as he watched them, their playful movements a stark contrast to the dire state they had been in just days before. Despite their progress, a fragile tension hung in the air. Mike was acutely aware of the risks he was taking. The mother bear's instinct to protect her cubs could turn deadly in an instant if she perceived him as a threat. He moved carefully, keeping the rope securing the door in place whenever he wasn't tending to them. Still, he couldn't shake the sense of connection he felt each time their eyes met through the small window. There was a silent understanding between them, a truce born of mutual need. As the snow began to settle, Mike ventured outside to assess the damage left by the storm. His boots crunched through the thick drifts as he shoveled a path to the woodpile and cleared the cabin's roof to prevent it from collapsing under the weight of the snow. The cold was sharp, but the sun's faint warmth reminded him that winter's grip would eventually loosen. Each time he returned to the cabin, Buddy's survival weighed on his mind. Though the bears were recovering, their presence posed a challenge to Mike's already dwindling supplies. The fish he had stored for his own use was nearly gone, and hunting was out of the question with the bears still occupying the storage room. He had started rationing his meals, cutting portions in half to ensure the bears could eat enough to regain their strength. Despite the hardships, the bears gave Mike something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He watched them closely, learning their patterns and movements. The mother bear had begun pacing near the door, a sign that her instincts to protect and provide for her cubs were returning. The cubs themselves were growing bolder, playfully swatting at each other when they weren't curled up against their mother's side. One evening, as Mike sat by the fire, the faint sound of movement caught his attention. He turned to see one of the cubs peeking through the gap in the door, its tiny head tilted inquisitively. Mike froze, unsure of what to do. The mother bear let out a low rumble, her warning clear, and the cub quickly retreated. Mike exhaled, his heart racing. "You've got a curious one there, Mama," he muttered, shaking his head. That moment stuck with him as he prepared for bed. The bears were healing, but their time in the cabin couldn't last forever. Mike knew the day was coming when he would have to let them go. It was a thought that filled him with equal parts relief and sorrow. The bears belonged to the wild, but their presence had brought a light into his life he hadn't realized he needed. Over the next few days, the tension between Mike and the bears began to ease. The mother bear no longer growled when he approached the door, and the cubs watched him with curiosity rather than fear. Mike began to speak to them more often, his voice filling the silence of the cabin. "You'll be heading back soon," he said one morning as he slid another tray of food through the door. "I'll miss you when you're gone, but this place isn't meant to hold you." The mother bear's eyes met his through the window, and for a moment, Mike felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. She had to know he wasn't a threat, that he had only ever meant to help. It was a fragile piece, but it was enough. One evening, as Mike prepared to stoke the fire, he noticed something unusual. The mother bear was standing near the door, her posture alert. She paced back and forth, her head turning toward the small window, as if she were waiting for something. Mike set down the log he was holding and approached cautiously. Through the window, he could see the cubs huddled together, watching their mother intently. Mike opened the door slightly, enough to peer inside. The mother bear didn't move, her eyes fixed on him with a steady gaze. Mike swallowed hard, his voice quiet. "You're ready, aren't you?" he asked. The bear let out a low rumble, a sound that seemed less like a warning and more like acknowledgement. The realization hit Mike like a wave. The bears were strong enough to leave. Their time in the cabin had given them the strength to face the wilderness again, and the mother bear's instincts were urging her to take her cubs back to the life they were meant to live. Mike spent the rest of the evening preparing for their departure. He cleared a path to the tree line, ensuring they would have a safe route away from the cabin. Inside, he gathered the last of his fish and placed it in a pile near the door, a final gesture of care for the animals that had become an unlikely part of his life. As the sun set, Mike stood by the storage room door, his hand resting on the rope. He hesitated, his chest tightening with emotion. "You'll be okay out there," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "You're stronger than the storm, stronger than anything out here." With a deep breath, he untied the rope and opened the door. The mother bear stepped forward cautiously, her cubs following close behind. She paused at the threshold, turning to look at Mike one last time. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Mike felt a deep, unshakable connection, a bond forged in the heart of a storm. The bears moved slowly toward the tree line, their figures fading into the shadows of the forest. Mike stood in the doorway, the cold wind biting at his face as he watched them go. When they finally disappeared from view, he closed the door and leaned against it, the silence of the cabin settling around him. He felt the absence immediately, a hollow ache in his chest. But as he stoked the fire and settled into his chair, he knew he had done the right thing. The bears had survived, and so had he. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, compassion could bridge the gap between man and nature. The cabin was quiet now, the kind of stillness that stretched endlessly in the wilderness, yet it felt different. Mike Anderson had grown used to solitude in his years living in the remote Alaskan forest, but the silence that followed the departure of the bear family weighed heavier than he expected. Days had passed since he had opened the door and watched the mother bear and her cubs disappear into the trees. He replayed the moment often, the way she had paused at the threshold, her dark eyes locking onto his, as if to say something he couldn't quite understand. Then just like that, they were gone, and the cabin felt emptier than it ever had. The storm's aftermath had left the land blanketed in thick snow that glistened under the winter sun. Mike busied himself with clearing paths, mending his tools, and hunting small game to replenish his depleted food stores. He moved through these tasks methodically, but his mind frequently drifted to the bears. Were they safe? Had they found shelter? Were the cubs strong enough to survive? He found himself scanning the edges of the forest whenever he stepped outside, hoping for a glimpse of their tracks or movement in the distance. But the snow remained undisturbed, and the forest gave no answers. One afternoon, while splitting firewood near the cabin, Mike noticed something unusual. A set of tracks cut through the snow at the edge of the field, fresh and deliberate. His heart quickened as he set down the axe and grabbed his binoculars. Squinting through the lenses, he followed the tracks until they disappeared into the tree line. They were too large to be from deer and too distinct to belong to wolves. Mike lowered the binoculars, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Could it be?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the faint whisper of the wind. The possibility filled him with equal parts excitement and concern. If the tracks belonged to the mother bear, why had she come so close? Was she in trouble? Were her cubs with her? Unable to shake the questions, Mike packed a small bag with essentials, a thermos of coffee, a few strips of dried meat, and his binoculars, and set off to follow the trail. The tracks led him deep into the woods, weaving between towering spruce trees and across frozen streams. The air was still, the only sounds his boots crunching through the snow and the occasional call of a raven overhead. As he walked, he thought about the bond he had formed with the bears during their brief time in his care. He had never imagined such a connection was possible, and yet it had felt natural, as though they had trusted him just as much as he had trusted them. Hours passed, and the light began to fade, painting the snow in shades of gold and orange. Just as Mike was about to turn back, he spotted movement ahead. He crouched low, his heart pounding as he strained to see through the trees. There, in a small clearing, stood the mother bear. Her massive frame was unmistakable, her fur dusted with snow as she sniffed the air. She turned her head slightly, and Mike's breath caught in his throat as he saw one of the cubs peeking out from behind her leg. Relief washed over him, followed by an unexpected wave of emotion. They had survived. He wanted to call out, to let her know he was there, but he held back, unsure of how she might react. Instead, he stayed where he was, watching as the cubs ventured out from behind their mother to play in the snow. Their small bodies moved with a newfound energy, tumbling over each other and chasing their own shadows. The sight brought a smile to Mike's face, and he felt a warmth spread through him despite the biting cold. The mother bear lifted her head suddenly, her nose twitching as she looked in Mike's direction. He froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. Their eyes met across the clearing, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. She didn't growl or move toward him, but her gaze held steady, as if acknowledging his presence. Mike raised a hand slowly, a silent gesture of reassurance. The bear huffed softly, her breath visible in the frigid air, before turning back to her cubs. Mike stayed there for a while, watching the family until the fading light forced him to head back. The hike to the cabin felt shorter somehow, his steps lighter with the knowledge that the bears were thriving. That night, as he sat by the fire, he found himself thinking about how much they had taught him in such a short time. Their resilience, their trust, their instinct to protect each other. It was a reminder of the strength that lay in connection, even in the harshest conditions. Over the next few weeks, signs of the bear's presence appeared more frequently around the cabin. Tracks crisscrossed the fields in the early mornings, and once Mike spotted claw marks on a tree near the edge of the woods. He began leaving small offerings of food at the base of the tree, a few fish, a bundle of berries, and they always disappeared by the next day. Though he never saw them up close again, he felt their presence in the quiet moments, as if they were keeping watch over him just as he had once watched over them. The bear's survival brought a new sense of purpose to Mike's days. He started journaling again, filling pages with sketches of the cubs and notes about the time they had spent in the cabin. Writing about them helped him process the experience, and in the process, he found himself reflecting on his own life. He thought about why he had chosen to live in the wilderness, about the isolation he had sought after losing so much in his past. The bears had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that even in solitude, connection was possible, and it could bring meaning to even the hardest days. One morning, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Mike stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the treetops. He felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that came from knowing he had done something that mattered. The bears had returned to the wild where they belonged, but they had left a mark on him that would never fade. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed fresh tracks leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. He smiled to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had shared. The wilderness was vast and unforgiving, but it was also filled with moments of unexpected connection, moments that reminded him why he had chosen this life. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Mike raised his mug of coffee in a silent toast. "To you, Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude and farewell. "You and those little ones, wherever you are." The flames danced in the fireplace, their light casting shadows on the walls, and Mike felt the warmth of their presence linger in the quiet cabin, a bond that would endure long after the snow had melted. The arrival of spring in the Alaskan wilderness was subtle but unmistakable. The air carried a faint warmth, and the snow that had once buried Mike Anderson's cabin began to recede, revealing patches of damp earth and the first signs of green. The days were longer now, the light stretching well into the evening, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. Mike stood on the porch, his hands resting on the railing, watching as the forest awakened around him. For weeks, the bears had been on his mind, their tracks still visible near the edges of his property. Though he hadn't seen them since that day in the clearing, He felt their presence in the small signs they left behind. A scuffed patch of earth, a snapped branch, the faint rumble of movement in the trees. Mike sipped his coffee, the rich aroma blending with the crisp morning air. He had always cherished this time of year, when the land transformed from a frozen wasteland into something vibrant and alive. But this spring felt different. The storm that had brought the bears to his door had also brought a shift within him. The solitude that had once been his refuge now felt less like an escape and more like a choice he was finally ready to embrace with clarity and purpose. As the weeks passed, the signs of the bears' activity grew more sporadic, and Mike knew they were moving farther into the wilderness. He often found himself looking toward the tree line, half hoping to see the mother bear's familiar silhouette. But the forest remained quiet. He focused on repairing the cabin and preparing his fields for the brief Alaskan summer, though his thoughts often wandered to the bears and their fate. He wondered how the cubs were faring, whether they had grown stronger, and if the mother bear had found a new den where they could thrive. One late afternoon, while stacking wood near the shed, Mike heard a faint rustling behind him. He froze, his pulse quickening as he turned toward the sound. At first, he saw nothing but the dense shadows of the forest, the trees standing tall and still. But then, a figure emerged, a large, lumbering form with a familiar gait. The mother bear stepped into the clearing, her fur shimmering in the golden light. Behind her, the two cubs followed, their once fragile bodies now sturdy and confident. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he watched them approach. The mother bear paused at the edge of the clearing, her dark eyes locking onto his. The cubs lingered behind her, their movements cautious but curious. Mike set down the bundle of wood in his hands, his heart pounding as he took a slow step forward. "You came back," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the gentle rustle of the trees. The bear huffed softly, a sound that carried no aggression, only recognition. She stood still for a moment longer, her gaze steady and unblinking. Then, with a deliberate movement, she turned and nudged the cubs forward, guiding them back toward the forest. Mike watched as they disappeared into the trees, their forms fading into the shadows like a dream slipping away. The encounter left Mike with a profound sense of peace. It wasn't just the reassurance that the bears had survived, it was the quiet acknowledgement that their bond, however brief, had mattered. He had opened his door to them in a moment of desperation, risking his safety to offer them a chance at survival. In return, they had reminded him of the resilience and interconnectedness of life, a lesson that lingered long after their tracks had vanished from the snow. In the days that followed, Mike threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He repaired the roof of the barn, cleared the last of the winter debris from the fields, and even began planting a small vegetable garden near the cabin. The wilderness no longer felt like a place of isolation. It felt alive, teeming with possibilities and connections he hadn't noticed before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike sat by the fire, the journal he had been keeping open on his lap. The pages were filled with sketches and notes about the bears, each entry a reflection of their time together. He had drawn the cubs as he remembered them, tiny and fragile at first, then playful and curious, their eyes bright with life. The mother bear's powerful form was sketched in bold lines, her presence commanding yet gentle. Mike picked up his pen and wrote a final entry, his hands steady as the words flowed onto the page. They came to me in the storm, and though they were wild and untamed, they reminded me of something I had forgotten. That even in the harshest winters, life finds a way to endure. Their strength became my strength, their survival my purpose. And as they return to the wild, I carry their lessons with me, a reminder that no one truly lives alone in this world. Closing the journal, Mike set it on the table and leaned back in his chair. The fire crackled softly, its warmth wrapping around him like a blanket. Outside, the first stars began to appear, their light faint but steady against the darkening sky. He thought about the bears, about the path they were forging deeper into the wilderness. They would face new challenges, but he had no doubt they would overcome them. As the night deepened, Mike stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. He stood there for a long time, his eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, beneath the same stars, the bears were moving forward, their journey continuing as it was meant to. and so too would his. With a deep breath, Mike turned and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him. The cabin was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It held the echoes of the storm, the warmth of shared survival, and the unspoken bond between man and nature. As he stoked the fire and prepared for bed, Mike felt a sense of fulfillment that was as vast and enduring as the wilderness itself. The bears had returned to the wild, but their presence remained, a reminder of resilience, of compassion, and of the simple truth that even in the most isolated corners of the world, connections could be forged and lives forever changed.